Joel Fitzgibbon is the government's chief whip. He joins us via Skype from the Hunter. Josh Frydenberg, the Liberal MP for Kooyong, is Skyping in from Melbourne. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Joel.
Good morning, fellas.
Joel Fitzgibbon, what does Labor have to do to turn around the public mood reflected in Monday's poll numbers?
Well, I think stay the course. We've gone through the worst financial downturn since the Great Depression, and government or governing has been very difficult, but we've got a very, very strong and progressive agenda, and we need to set the noise aside and get on with the work of governing.
I thought it was interesting with what Joel said, that he said the party needed to stay the course, but he didn't say the party needed to stay the course with the same leader, because he and many of his caucus colleagues want to see a change in leader, and that's hugely destabilising. And as far as we're concerned, as far as the Australian people are concerned, it doesn't matter who is the Labor Party leader or the Prime Minister, indeed. It's the Labor Party and the government's record which the next election will be fought on. And that has seen, disaster after disaster, growing debt, increasing regulation, 27 new taxes, and I could go on with a laundry list of failures.
There is no counting. Kevin Rudd's made it clear he's not a candidate for the leadership. And on that basis, not just on that basis, but given that it's obvious to all and sundry that we're behind the leader and we're all focused on the main game.
Let's look at Christine Milne's decision of yesterday to call an end to the relationship between the Greens and the government. Josh Frydenberg, might it be that Labor is a more powerful opponent for the opposition at the next election without the Greens than it was if it was still in a relationship with them?
Look, they effectively are still in a relationship, despite the grandstanding by Christine Milne and a few counter-accusations from Labor members of Parliament. Because at the end of the day, the Greens are still voting on the floor of the House with Adam Bandt and in the Senate to support the Labor Party's and the government's policies. And so they're keeping them on effectively life support until whenever the election is held on September the 14th or earlier. So, this is not really a breakup. This is just a bit of grandstanding by Christine Milne, given the fact that a number of her Senate candidates and also Adam Bandt in the lower house are going to be fighting the battles of their lives coming up at the next election. But in reality, the Greens are equally responsible with the Labor Party for these horrendous policies that we've seen, whether it's the carbon tax, whether it's the mining tax, whether it's the re-regulation of the labour market and so on. So I don't, for a minute think this is a really important manoeuvre by the Greens, because they're still propping up a failed government.
Joel Fitzgibbon, is this just tokenism from Christine Milne?
No, I think she made that very clear, Tim. Look, I disagree with the Greens on many things, and I've made those views very public. The government disagrees with the Greens on many things, but I'm pleased, notwithstanding that the Greens still are of the view collectively that the best thing for the country is for Labor to remain in government and for us to have a stable parliament as we possibly can. And that is the outcome of her announcement yesterday. But at the same time, we will feel freer to get on with our own agenda and not to be tied too tightly to the Greens' agenda. But certainly, being seen to be close to the Greens has been in many ways damaging for the party and for the government.
And it's part of the problem Labor now faces.
Well, there's a legacy issue there because, I go back to the way we had to adjust our position on the carbon constraint. We had no choice but to put in place a fixed price period for your period of time. That was a direct result of the negotiations with the Greens. Others portrayed that.
So you're blaming them now, Joel?
Many portrayed that, Josh, as a backflip from the Prime Minister. When it wasn't a backflip, when she said there'd be no carbon tax, she could not have known that she wouldn't be a Prime Minister in her own right or be governing in her own right. And the reality of a hung parliament brought the necessities of compromise.
Josh Frydenberg, is it fair for the government to say that part of their problems at the moment are the relationship they had to form with the Greens to make it work?
No, No, their problem is the policies that they've introduced, and it's one thing for Joel to say, "Well, oh, look, the carbon tax as it was introduced was, the responsibility effectively of the Greens." It's not. It's the responsibility of the Prime Minister and the government that has introduced it. And when she said one thing to the Australian people before the election, did another after the election, she needs to be held to account for that. And if she were as true to her word, she wouldn't have formed government on the basis of breaking that solemn promise. So I think, this is a bit of ex post facto explanation from the government, which just doesn't wash with the Australian people.
Josh Frydenberg, you probably would have seen the Four Corners ABC report this week with regard to the Joint Strike Fighter. 5-year or more delay on the program. They're now costing $130 million or more a unit.
Look, as you know, this is a joint program, and so, there are going to be issues not just within the confines of the Australian government's responsibility, but also things that are happening offshore. But that is very separate from the point that this government has cut defence spending to a dangerously low level, and it's down to 1.56% of GDP from the 2% of GDP that it was under the Howard government, and comes at a time, Tim, when everyone else in the region is spending more and more on defence.
Well, nice politicisation of the question, Josh. Josh does want to talk about the JSF because it's a Howard government legacy, but I wouldn't be critical of Howard because if I'd been Minister or Prime Minister at the time, I would have signed up as a partner to the development project. It was a relatively small amount of money for some potentially very, very good outcomes for the country. But what I was very strongly reminded of during the ABC Four Corners program was the disproportionate influence of those in uniform, both on the former government and the current government, who were in love with this project. A project, by the way, which still might deliver great capability to the country. I know, classified things about the JSF many don't know, and which I can't talk about. So there is hope that this will be a worthwhile project to Australia. But when I was trying to put some strategic competition into the debate by inquiring about access to the F-22 Raptor and things like and aircraft like the Eurofighter, I was, of course, pilloried by those in uniform. Interference was run. The generals, if you like, to use the vernacular, although in this case it might be more apt to say the air marshals, were obsessed with the project and were disproportionately influential. Look, it might still be all right in the end, but we were, certainly John Howard left us with a capability gap, which we, of course, had to deal with in government, as did Brendan Nelson. And, of course, the air marshals ran interference on my successful attempts in the end, to invest heavily in the growler capacity of the Super Hornet, because they feared that might somehow undermine the long-term purchase of the Joint Strike Fighter. So I think the big thing to come out of the Four Corners program was the disproportionate influence of those in uniform on the politicians of the day.
Joel Fitzgibbon and Josh Frydenberg, we're way out of time, but fascinating talking with you both as always, and look forward to talking again next week, eh?
That's a pleasure, Tim.
Thank you.